As you see, we have a group of government officials who have been dealing with this nuclear reactor accident issue all along. Some of the faces you might have seen on television, because they do briefing every day for the Japanese New Year. But they are generous enough to come to our club, mostly for the foreign media outlet. So today we have three speakers. We'll make the speech first. Then we have a total of actually 5 people who are here to answer your questions afterwards. Let me just introduce the speakers to the speakers first. Okay. From the far left is Mr. Tatsutoshi Kobayashi. He's from the Agricultural Fishery Ministry. He's the Director of Marketing and Processing Industry Office. And he will answer questions regarding the contamination of food. And that's Mr. Kobayashi. And then next to Mr. Kobayashi is some of you, I'm sure, are familiar faces. Mr. Takeshi Matsunaga. He's the Assistant Press Secretary of the Foreign Ministry. He's also the Director of International Precision, of course. And then we have Ms. Konuma as our interpreter today. And then we have Mr. Nishiyama. He appears on television every day these days. He's the Director General for International Trade Policy of Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. That's actually his official title at METI. And then we have Mr. Sato. He is the Vice President of Japan Nuclear Energy Safety Organization. And then we have Mr. Shikata. He's Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Public Relations and Director of Global Communications, basically a spokesperson for the Cabinet. And I'm Tetsuo Jimbo with the Video News, a long-time member of this club. And first, Mr. Shikata and Mr. Nishiyama and Mr. Matsunaga will make a brief speech first. For a total of about 20 minutes. Then they will take your questions. So, Mr. Shikata, please start.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for introduction, Mr. Jimbo. My name is Norishi Shikata, Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Public Relations at the Prime Minister's Office. In my initial remarks, I would like to come up with the overview of the Japanese government perspective, and also especially the message from Prime Minister Naoto Kan. As you are all well aware, this now named the Great East Japan Earthquake was one of the most severe and tragic disaster that hit this country. And we have seen the disaster left more than about 14,000 people who are dead, and nearly 14,000 people who are still missing, including foreign citizens who lived or stayed in Japan. With all-out government efforts, there were over 26,000 people who were rescued, thanks to the efforts of self-defense forces, police, firefighters, and also international rescue teams. Since March 11, Japan has been so much supported by friends across the world. And this is something that all the Japanese people express gratitude for this outpouring of support and solidarity that we receive from the rest of the world. We have received more than 130 countries, nearly 40 international organizations supporting us, as well as non-governmental organizations and countless individuals. And this is something that we have found deeply moving. And at this time of hardship, I believe that many Japanese have been moved by this outpouring of support from all over the world. Of course, at this juncture, we are focusing on tackling the situation at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. As a government, we take the situation very seriously and deeply regret that the nuclear accident we have had at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Our top priority now is bringing the situation at the plant under control at the earliest possible date. The Japanese government has been mobilizing all available resources to combat the risks posed by the plant. And we have established three principles. Number one is give the highest priority to the safety and health of all citizens, especially those who live very close to the plant. Number two is we will conduct thorough risk management. And number three is we plan for all possible scenarios so that we are fully prepared to respond to any future situations. In relation to this, we have been taking every possible measure to ensure the safety of all food and other products based on strict scientific criteria. We have taken great precautions so that safety of all Japanese food and products that reach the market has been and will continue to be ensured. We have seen some cases that our trading partners have been introducing excessive trade restrictions, and we are calling for the calm response based on scientific understanding. At the same time, we are aware of the need to assure both domestic and foreign consumers that the Japanese food and products are safe, and we need to redouble our efforts to maintain transparency and keep everyone informed of our progress, especially regarding the situation surrounding Fukushima Daiichi. Just for your information, the 16 government ministries and agencies have started to introduce ingredients, vegetables, fruits, and others from affected areas, prefectures, including Fukushima Prefecture. These ministries include Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Health and Welfare, and Prime Minister's Office as well. We are providing salad bar for our employees coming from Fukushima and Ibaraki, Tochigi, and other areas. Some of the menus include things like chicken curry or vegetable curry, or pepperoncino with spinach. And this includes the ones made in Fukushima Prefecture. We think that the Japanese food safety standard is among the most stringent, and all the foods being distributed to the market, including those being exported, are completely safe. As for the future of the nuclear power plant or energy policy, or lessons learned from this Fukushima Daiichi in particular, the Japanese government will be conducting thorough verification into the cause of the incident, and we will share information and the lessons learned with the rest of the world to help prevent such accidents in the future. When Prime Minister Khan will go to France to attend the Deauville G8 summit, I'm sure that Prime Minister will have a chance to discuss those issues, including how to assure nuclear safety, or the future of coming up with new international standards to assure nuclear safety. At the same time, we will be revisiting our energy policy, and I'm sure that during the month to come, we will be discussing what kind of energy policy we will be pursuing, and we have to address the issues in this context, such issues as rising global energy demand or reducing green gas emissions. And in this context, we'll be discussing very intensively how we could aggressively promote clean energy, both generation and use of clean energy in this country. Lastly, we have just started the process of discussion of reconstruction of Tohoku region. And as many of you are aware, the Reconstruction Design Council, headed by Professor Yokibe, head of the National Defense Academy, has just started. Professor Yokibe has already mentioned that the discussion aims to create a new Tohoku model, learning lessons of suffering from disasters, and we wish to recreate the new Tohoku. And this is something that Professor Yokibe and other council members will be discussing, and we are looking forward to receiving the reports from this group. And in this context, from our viewpoint, we think that it is important to create regional society that is highly resistant to natural disasters, including tsunami and quakes. And number two is establishing a social system that allows people to live in harmony with the global environment. And lastly, we need to build a compassionate society that cares about people, in particular, the vulnerable. In the context of recreating or rebuilding the Tohoku region, we think that it is important to receive wisdom from the rest of the world. And we think that this kind of venue at FCCJ is also a very important opportunity for us to listen to different perspectives from the audience attending here. So thank you very much for your understanding.
Okay, Ms. Nishiyama, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hidehiko Nishiyama, and I'm now working for Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency of METI, our ministry. First, I'd like to look back at what happened since March 11th, and then I'd like to touch upon the roadmap, which was published by TEPCO, and our strategy based on the roadmap. First of all, the brief history since March 11. There are 4 major nuclear power stations in the area hit by the earthquake and the tsunamis, consisting 14 units of reactors altogether. Out of the 14 reactors at the 4 power stations, including Fukushima Daiichi, 11 had been in operation at the time of the earthquake. Responding to the earthquake, all operating reactors automatically and successfully went into emergency shutdown. However, this was not the end of the story at the Fukushima Daiichi. About 1 hour later, massive tsunamis, 40 meters or higher, followed the earthquake and washed away all the electricity sources and the backup heat removal systems. The loss of electricity sources and heat removal systems caused the rising decay heat and pressure in the reactor vessels and at Unit 1, 2, and 3, which were in operation, and soared the temperature in the spent fuel pool at Unit 4, which was in period of inspection. The rising heat and pressure led to the hydrogen explosions at the reactor buildings in Units 1 and 3. The damage of the suppression pool in the Unit 2 reactor, and the fire at Unit 4 reactor building. In bringing the situation at Fukushima Daiichi under control, we are confronted with 4 key challenges. The first challenge is to cool down the reactors. Initially, we used seawater as an emergency measure to cool the reactors and the spent fuel pools. Now, we are injecting fresh or pure water. At the same time, we are making the utmost effort to restore or newly establish the cooling functions. The second challenge is to prevent the diffusion of radioactive materials. A part of the highly contaminated water that we suspected leaked out from the reactors was disturbing the restoration works at stagnant water in the turbine buildings, and in one case, escaping into the sea. Good news is that we have succeeded in stopping this outflow. Here I have to say that in order to prevent highly contaminated water from flowing out, we started to release the very low-level contaminated water brought by tsunami from large-scale radiated waste disposal system to the sea to free up space for keeping the highly contaminated water instead. This is one of the inevitable and necessary countermeasures to contain radioactive materials. Actually, only 10 liters of the highly contaminated water is equivalent to 20 million liters of the low-level contaminated water we have been releasing. I would like to seek a kind understanding of the countries concerned. Actually, this morning we began transferring highly radiated water from the trench attached to the Unit 2 to this radiated waste disposal system. The third challenge is vigorous and intensive monitoring radioactivity in the atmosphere, sea, seawater, soil, food, and drinking water. We will make sure that the information is made available to the public and to the world as quickly as possible. All the information is now published in English in our website. The levels of radioactivity at the site were very high from March 15th to 16th, but are now stabilized at 2 digits of millisievert per hour. And last but not least, the fourth challenge is to ensure the safety, in particular, the safety of food and drinking water. Next, I'd like to touch upon TEPCO's roadmap towards restoration from the accident at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, which was published on April 17th. In this roadmap, the following two steps are set as targets. Step 1 is radiation dose is in steady decline. Step 2, release of radioactive materials is under control, and radiation dose is being significantly held down. Target achievement dates are tentatively set as follows, although there will still be various uncertainties and risks. Step 1, around 3 months. Step 2, around 3 to 6 months after achieving step 1. Now I'd like to describe our strategy on each unit from unit 1 through 4 based on this TEPCO's strategy roadmap. Regarding Unit 1 of Fukushima Daiichi, as we inject nitrogen to the containment vessel of this unit, we came to know that the water we introduced to the pressured vessel stays and accumulates in the containment vessel. Taking advantage of this fact, we are aiming at flooding the containment vessel up to the top of the active fuel as a measure of cooling. In addition to this flooding, we will seek to install heat exchangers. We need to conduct an on-site research and to draw detailed design before we begin to work. Regarding Unit 2, this unit suffered from an explosion at the suppression pool. This is the suppression pool is beneath the lower part of the containment vessel. Therefore, it will be difficult for us to flood the containment vessel of the Unit 2 because of the damage there. We will consider, on one hand, we will consider a sealing measure at the damaged location. If we are successful, we will implement cooling measures similar to those for the Unit 1. On the other hand, it is important to store the highly radiated water in the from this Unit 2 in the radiated waste disposal system, which I mentioned earlier, and also it is important to decontaminate and desalt this water with newly created water processing facilities and store the water in tanks. And we may be able to reuse the processed water on reactor coolant as reactor coolant. For the Unit 3, it is important to remove debris so that we can do the following work smoothly. First, we will begin to inject nitrogen to the containment vessel of the Unit 3. Seeing the result of it, we will flood the containment vessel up to the top of active fuel as we are doing regarding Unit 1. We will also seek to install heat exchangers. We need to conduct an on-site research and to draw a detailed design before we begin to work. And to do those works, especially to install heat exchangers, it is inevitable to have an access to the reactor buildings. We are assessing the radiation condition there, including radiation with robots. We found radiation dose in the Unit 1 and 3 ranging from 10 to 57 millisievert per hour. Regarding spent fuel pools, to cool the spent fuel pools, now fresh water is injected from outside for the units 1, 3, and 4, and through normal cooling line for the unit 2. We'll continue to inject water in the same way, and we will try to restore normal cooling system for the units 1, 3, and 4. We may be able to install heat exchangers also for this cooling system. Regarding Unit 4's spent fuel pool, in addition to those measures, we will try to install supporting structure under the bottom of the pool of the Unit 4. Regarding the mitigation of release of radioactive materials to atmosphere and from soil, we recognize that debris are scattered outside the buildings, and radioactive materials are being scattered. We will inhibit scattering of radioactive materials by full-scale dispersion of inhibitor, synthetic plastic, after confirming its performance by test. We will remove debris with remotely controlled units. And also we will begin installing reactor building cover with ventilation and filter to shield the radiation or radiated materials fly over to the other places. And lastly, we will expand and enhance monitoring and inform of results fast and accurately. To conclude my presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce Minister Kaeda's comments on this roadmap. He stated 3 things. First, the government will request TEPCO to ensure the implementation of this roadmap steadily and as early as possible. To this end, our agency and others will make regular follow-up monitoring of the progress of the works and the necessary safety checks. Secondly, the government will request TEPCO to ensure the mobilization and deployment of workers, the procurement and preparation of equipment and materials. And thirdly, at the end of step 2, the release of radioactive materials will be under control. At this stage, the government will review the deliberate evacuation area and evacuation prepared area. Up until that time, we will consider the details of review criteria and will decontaminate the widest possible area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mr. Matsunaga, please.
Thank you, Mr. Jimbo, for your kind introduction. To save time for questions and answers, I'd like to confine my initial remark only to, as promised to Mr. Jimbo, only to 3 minutes, referring only to the upcoming diplomatic event, which has close association with the earthquake, which concerns the Australian Prime Minister Gillard's visit, which starts tomorrow. She will arrive tomorrow and stays until coming Saturday. And the objective of the visit is closely related to the earthquake, countermeasures to the earthquake, particularly from Japanese point of view. One of our objectives is appealing to the world Japan's determination for its rebirth and reconstruction, as eloquently explained by Mr. Shikata. In that context, we would like to appeal to the world the unchanged basic tenet of Japanese diplomacy despite the disaster. And also we would like to strengthen cooperation with Australia with respect to energy, which is clearly the major supplier of energy and food to Japan. And third, from our point of view, our objective is focused on strengthening cooperation on disaster management. In that respect, I would like to mention that Australia made a great cooperation in response to the great earthquake. I only would like to mention one example. Australia has 4 C-17 transportation aircraft, and they diverted 3 out of 4 C-17 they have in response to the earthquake in Japan. One of 4 C-14 they have was in maintenance status, and they diverted all remaining 3 to respond to the situation in Japan. One of the C-17 was used to transport the Australian rescue team. Then thereafter, the C-17 was used as long as 10 days to transport in Japan the personnel as well as relief supplies of the Japanese self-defense force. And the remaining 2 C-17s were used to transport a specially designed pump for the purpose of cooling the reactors in Fukushima. And one of these 2 was originally deployed in Afghanistan, and that particular C-17 was also used in response to the situation in Japan. In those regards, we highly appreciate the cooperation extended by Australia. Of course, without needless to say, Australia is a very important friend of Japan. For example, as I mentioned, it is a major supplier of energy and food, and it shares common values such as market-oriented principle and democracy. And also, Australia and Japan shares intention and capacity to contribute to the peace and stability of the region. In those regards too, we happily welcome Prime Minister Gillard. And lastly, I would like to briefly mention about the schedule of Prime Minister Gillard, which is related to the earthquake. Prime Minister Gillard have the audience by their Majesties, the Emperor and the Empress, and of course she will have a meeting with Prime Minister Khan, followed by joint press conference and working dinner. And she will deliver a policy speech, and the last day of her stay, on Saturday, she is scheduled to visit Minami Sanriku-cho of Miyagi Prefecture. In that respect, I would like to mention that that town of Minami Sanriku-cho was a place where Australian rescue team was deployed. 75 personnel as well as 2 rescue dogs came from Australia, undertake rescue and search activities from 16th to 19th of March. In collaboration with Japanese firefighters rescue team. And at the end of their activities, they donated their medical equipment, tents, fuels, water, and food stuff to the city of Tome. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, let's proceed to Q&A. Mr. Nishiyama will answer your questions in Japanese, which will be translated. And also questions in English to Mr. Nishiyama will be translated in Japanese. And Mr. Shikata and Mr. Matsunaga will answer the questions in English. As usual, please state your affiliation and no speech, please. Okay, go ahead.
John Boyd, IEEE, IEEE Spectrum Magazine. A question for Mr. Nishiyama. But before I ask the question, I'd just like to thank Nishiyama-san. You've been attending the evening briefs at the Kantei for the foreign press, holding Japanese briefings as well. Never taken a holiday as far as I can see. I think that's outstanding. Thank you. And for appearing here today as well. In your nightly briefings, you've often mentioned that the parameters of the reactors, and you've mentioned like pressure and temperature. Given that nobody has entered the reactor buildings, and I suppose the control rooms that operate the reactors, there must be some damage to the instruments and to the connections to the reactors. Could you give us some details of how you are getting these parameter readings, please? Thank you.
ジョン・ボイド、IEEE から参りました西山さんの質問でございます。その前にまず一言お礼を申し上げたいと思います。官邸での毎晩開かれております海外向けのブリーフと、毎日を休みなくこのような会見に応じていただきまた今日もありがとうございます。さて、この、夕刻開かれるこのブリーフィングにおいてしばしば原子炉のパラメータに言及されております。この原子炉の圧力ですとか温度ですとか、しかしながら誰もこの原子炉の建屋にはアクセスできていないというふうに思っておりますし、またその制御室においてもおそらく計器類と一部少なくとも損傷を受けているのではないかと思います。ですからそういったような中でどのようにしてこのようなパラメータを取得しておられるのかについて詳細ご説明いただけますでしょうか。
まず電気が一時使えなくなっていたわけなので、わけですし、それからこの計器の中でも故障しているものもおそらくあると思われるんですけれども、そこについて確認することはできない状態でありました。
Well, first of all, it's true that at one point in time there was no power, and also it is likely that there is failure in the instrumentation, and therefore, though that was the case, we were not able to confirm whether or not there was any such failure.
電気が来てない間にやってたことはその作業員がバッテリーをその計器のところまで持って行って、それでその部分の測定をしていたと聞いております。でそれでしかし得られた値が必ず正しいかどうかというのは未だもってはっきりはいたしません。
And while we were without power during that time, what was done here is that the workers brought batteries to the instrumentation so as to be able to use the instrumentation, and it is from there that they obtained these measurements. However, whether or not these values were accurate, we do not know even today.
それでデータの正確性を今指しているのは、他のデータとの整合性というか動きの関係を見たり、あるいはその、変化した時の状況を見てデータの正しさを知るというようなことをしています。
And so in order to try to ensure the accuracy of the data, what we're doing is to try to match it up and compare it to other data taken under certain similar situations. And also if we see a change in the measuring, we try to look at the situation under which those changes have taken place to try to justify or not the readings.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. I'd like to ask just more information on the decision-making process in all this. Extremely complex operation. Two aspects. One, how much of the final decision-making is actually in the hands of TEPCO executives, and how much is in the hands of other government officials. And there are many foreign experts here. How direct an input do they have into this process? What it ultimately my question comes down to is who is in charge, who makes the final critical decisions on strategies in dealing with this situation?
シンガポールビジネスタイムのものでございますけれども、この意思決定プロセスを見てまいりますと、非常に複雑に見えてなりません。ここには2つの側面があるかと思いますが、最終的に意思決定というのはどの程度がいわゆるその東電の役員によってなされているのか、そしてどの程度が政府高官によってなされているのか、ということに関してもう少し確認をしたいと思います。さらに加えて今海外からの専門家も来ております。こういった方々の直接的なこの意思決定プロセスにおけるインプット、どのぐらい影響力があるのかということについてお聞きしたいと思います。なぜお聞きするかというと、こういった極めて重要な戦略等を決めるにあたって、果たして誰がその意思決定をする、そういった責任を持っているのかをぜひ知りたいと思います。
Who wants to take the question? Who wants to answer the question? Anyone? Or Anthony, who is this addressed to? Shikata-san?
石方さんか西山さんか。
Okay.
Well, I'll do a kind of an overall part. As you remember, on the 15th of March, there was a integrated headquarters established to respond to the accidents at Fukushima Daiichi. And it is a very unusual or rare case that the government related headquarters are located inside the headquarters of a company. But given what has been happening during the first 4 or 5 days, and after Prime Minister Khan visiting TEPCO, there was a decision made to establish, this integrated headquarters. So this headquarters itself is headed by Prime Minister, and deputy heads are METI Minister Kaeda and head of TEPCO. So it's kind of joint structure, and the purpose is to first of all to share information simultaneously. There was an issue of lag in terms of information transferred from TEPCO to the government, and we want to resolve those time lag issues. And at the same time, we wanted to tackle the situation jointly. So there is a response aspect where TEPCO and the government need to tackle together. And in this process, as you mentioned, there are external assistance extended, and both in terms of material assistance as well as knowledge or experts aspect, especially, for example, coming from the United States and France. So this is the combined efforts, but at the core, it is joint efforts between the government and TEPCO. But in terms of concrete actions, it's probably Mr. Nishiyama to explain further.
今、鹿田さんが言われた通りで、その大きな構造の中で、やはり現場であるその福島第一の吉田所長を中心とするチームが一番現場のことを分かっているので、その人たちがある程度戦略を立て、それからそれに対して本店で今の鹿田さんが言われたチームがそれを受けて、その両者で決めていく。そして今鹿田さんが言われた広い関係者の力を動員してこの事態に当たっているということだと思います。
Yes, and as Mr. Shikata has rightly mentioned, there is this big structure in place, and at the same time, there is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, which is the forefront of this accident. Mr. Yoshida is heading the nuclear power station, so on the other side, there is this nuclear power station. And so they put together a strategy to a certain extent, and this is informed to the head office, where this integrated team is located, and receiving this information. These two major bodies, the government and TEPCO, consult and decide with the input coming from the various stakeholders that have just been described.
Okay, next question. Yeah.
Keith Bradshaw, New York Times. Some questions about the water for Mr. Nishiyama. Your initial rate of pumping that started today, as I understand, is a little under 500 cubic meters. So that would be 20 days for the first 10,000 cubic meters, and then you're talking, as I understand it, about several times more than that if you start looking at the other buildings. Are you going to have similar pumping rates for each of the reactors? Also, how does the total volume of the trenches compare to what you can put into the waste treatment center where you plan to seal the doors and use the whole building as a structure? I've seen estimates that as much as twice as much water is in the trenches as will fit into that building. And finally, do you anticipate more discharges of low-level or high-level water into the ocean? Thank you.
ニューヨークタイムズのものでございます。西山さんへの質問です。今の対流水に関してお聞きしたいというふうに思っております。今日現在、その組み出しのこのスピードでありますけれども、300リューベというふうにお聞きしておりますし、全体で考えますと1万リューベを考えた場合には20日間ぐらいはかかるといったそういったペースで進んでいるのはなかなかと思います。当初言われていたよりももう少しゆっくりとしたスピードのように思えるんですけれども、すべての建屋についてその現象について同じような形で同じようなスピードで水を汲み出していかれるようなそういったご予定でしょうか。それが今現在トレンチに溜まっている水の量全部合わせますとどのぐらいになるんでしょうか。そのある建屋この排水処理の建屋にこの水を溜めてそして封印をするというようなお話を伺っておりますけれども、今現在このトレンチに溜まっている量がおそらくこの容量建屋の容量の2倍ぐらいになっているのではないかというふうに考えられるんですけれども、その点はいかがなんでしょうか。そして今後この低レベルないしは高レベルの放射性物質を帯びたこの汚染水これを海に投下する排出するという可能性はあるんでしょうか。
まず最後の点から先にお答えすると海に排出することは全く考えておりません。
Well, allow me to answer your last question first. We have no plans whatsoever to discharge contaminated water into the sea.
それから大体、今水を移送するペースは今言われたようなペースでありまして、でその移送した水をきれいにする装置をつけて、それによってきれいにしながらまたそれで空いたスペースに次の水を運び込むというやり方をしようと思っています。
Now, so the plan is, well, of course, the transfer speed of the contaminated water is relatively the speed that you've just described, but the plan is to install a purification device so that we can purify the water and then free up some space to store the additional contaminated water.
それから全体として溜まっている水は、大体各号機1号機から3号機の各号機について、2万トンから2万5000トンとかそのぐらいの、量ですので、大体全体でいくと7万トン弱ぐらいの量ではないかと思っています。
And as for the total amount of stagnant water that has built up from units 1 to 3, well, it's between 20,000 to 25,000 tons. So all added up, it will come to some 70,000 tons.
全部を今移送しているラードウェイストというんですけども、そこに全部を入れるということはないわけです。順番に入れてはきれいにして出していくという形になります。
And so the idea is that when we transfer the contaminated water, it's not that they will be stored in one single waste treatment building, but instead there is this lag waste, as we call it, where we will purify the contaminated water which is being stored and release this water for recirculation and open up space to take in the the contaminated water that is coming in.
Okay, next question.
William Sposato, Dow Jones News Service. Two fairly technical questions. Number one, you've decided to raise the water levels in 1 and 3, and eventually number 2, up to cover the entire fuel rod assembly. Wondering why that decision is being taken now. If it's a good measure for cooling, why wasn't it done, say, 2 or 3 weeks ago? Second question on the pumps that are in the basements of the 1 and 3 units. Are these going to be necessary in terms of creation of the new heat exchange system? Or given the high radiation levels in the basements, have you given up on trying to rehabilitate those pump units and use them? Or are they still critical for what you're going to do?
はい、ダウン・ジョーンズのものでございますけれども、2つ、かなりテクニカルな質問をさせていただきたいというふうに思います。1と3号機に関してでありますけれども、この度その燃料域上部まで格納容器、これを水で満たすというような決定をされたというふうに今回伺っておりますけれども、これというのはなぜ今決められたのかということをまず確認をしておきたいと思います。それからもしこれがその冷却上非常にいい手法であるならば、どうして例えば2週間前ほどにこのような措置を決めなかったのかをお聞きしたいというふうに思います。それから2つ目でありますけれども、ポンプ、1号機と3号機の地下にあるポンプでありますけれども、これはその依然としてその必要だというふうに理解しておりますけれども、これはその新しい熱交換器を作るために必要なんでしょうか。ないしはその非常に放射線量がこの地下多いということで、その今現在そこでのポンプ、これを使うことも諦めていらっしゃるのか、その点を確認したいというふうに思います。
まず最初の方のことはもともと水で満たすアイデアはありましたけれども、それがはっきりできるというふうに確信を持つに至ったのは窒素を入れてみて、それで水がある程度溜まっているということが窒素を入れていた時の圧力の変化によって分かってきたことが一つのきっかけだったと思います。
Well, to answer your first question about this idea to flood the containment vessel to the top of the actual field, this idea, we had this idea before, but we became confident that this is feasible after injecting nitrogen into the vessel. Through the process of injecting nitrogen, we were able to confirm that the water was building up inside the vessel. Judging from the change which was observed in the pressure level. And that being the case, because we were able to confirm this, we decided that this would be a good idea.
それから1号機3号機のすでに設置されてあるポンプについてはそれを使うということも試みてきましたけれども、今現在ではなかなかそれを生かすことができるかどうか確信が持てないので、今はその外につけるポンプを主に考えているということです。
And as for the pumps in the basement of the number 1 and number 3 unit, whether they are usable or not, we have attempted to use the pumps, but at this point in time we cannot say for sure that they are usable, so instead, presently we are considering installing pumps from outside.
Okay, this we should be right.
Matt Smith from CNN. A question for Mr. Shikata. Given the number of people who've been displaced by this accident in the area around the plant, do you know how much do you plan to spend to take care of these folks for this period of 6 to 9 months or more that they're going to be displaced?
はい、CNN のものでございますが、四方さんへの質問をさせていただきたいと思います。今現在、この原子炉周辺で、避難をされている方々がおられます。で、この先その避難をされる期間が何ヶ月、ないしは9ヶ月というふうに言われておりますけれども、その間政府としてはどのぐらいの資金を投入すると、公的資金を投入するということを考えていらっしゃるんでしょうか。
I guess on that question, we don't have a definitive figure in terms of how much it could cost, and we are mobilizing our resources in order to tackle the situation to relieve the burdens on those people, who are especially who have evacuated from the area, and we know that it's going to cost quite significant amount, but at this juncture, I don't think we have come to the specific kind of budget size regarding the point you mentioned.
Do you have a range?
ある程度幅はございますか？
I don't think so. I think this is an evolving program, and also we have to follow up on the evolving situation in 20 or 30 kilometer radius, and also a degree of the damage, and so I think it's going to take some time before we come up with a concrete budget.
John Harris, number 1 Shimbun. For Shikata-san, again, I just spent a couple of days with 2 refugees one from Minami-Soma, one from Namie, who had come down to Onjuku where I live, trying to find whether they could bring their families there. And the previous question was about how much money in total. My question is, when are they going to get this? The million yen, 100 yen was announced the other day, but I had to pay out of my own pocket their train fares to go back up to Fukushima. And at this moment, they don't have anything. So that's my first question. When is the immediate money going to arrive? The second question is, there seems to be a lack in the Hinanjo, in the refugee centers, there seems to be a lack of information. There are all sorts of opportunities for refugees to move to other places. The town I live in, Onjuku, we're ready to welcome 400 people. We've got the Minshiku and accommodation for surfers that's empty, but nobody's taking us up on it. I understand that other towns are, but it seems that people are reluctant, afraid, they lack information, and I'm wondering what you're planning to do in order to give the refugees the confidence to move out of the Taikukan, the sports centers and places where they are, and seek more comfortable accommodation. Thank you.
はい、まずですね、私、ナンバーワン新聞ですけれども、鹿田さんにさらにこの避難されている方々についてお聞きをしたいと思います。私、御宿におりまして、南相馬、そしてまた浪江の方からお越しになった方々と数日前にお会いすることができた